Hello, and this is my final Odyssey video, at least for now. And this is for both teachers, uh, any reader who's interested in digging a little more deeply into the world of Homer and the Odyssey and maybe the Iliad. And it's also for students looking for really good resources for further reading and maybe some research. So these are my 10 most engaging and useful Odyssey resources. This book, by the way, I bought for a friend when she had her daughter last year. It is a board book of the monsters in the Odyssey. So if you have any little ones being born in your life, start them off with little tidbits of monsters from epic poems, and you can't. That's good parenting, is what that is. So first, and this could be a whole separate podcast. I teach high school. I'm not a scholar. I like the books I like, and I get to teach them, and I'm very lucky. How much criticism and commentary should one read, right? And most readers are not academics. Most readers are not scholars at universities publishing monographs on work of literature. They're just people reading books. Why would I make a video like this? Isn't it enough just to read the book closely? It is. It is. I'm aware that there's a pretty substantial group of people who wants to have access to what's considered great classic literature. But for whatever reason, in their experience in school or their own challenges, they struggle accessing it. These resources can help you enter a text like this. The other reason that doesn't get a lot of discussion is that maybe your experience in school with something like the Odyssey wasn't great because the teacher himself didn't love it. I think this is you have to sell this book. It doesn't sell itself, as I've said. So you have to love it. Now, what if it's in your curriculum and you, in fact, don't love it? I'm also aware that there are works of literature that I acknowledge are important or objectively good that I don't particularly like, So, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people feel that way about Homer. So these are books, once you're a teacher or once you're working or once you're a student with, 5 subjects, it's hard to carve out the time for things like this. But what these books and videos surround you with are people that love it. And I think the love of books can be infectious if it's communicated effectively. So to me, that's number one. If there's a mathematical order of operations with books like this, fall in love with the idea of reading great old books that can really help you read any books going forward. Fall in love with the idea that you don't have to really know everything, that you don't have to understand every single word on the page, all the references, all the names, all the backstories. Fall in love with the moments in the poem that stand out to you, and then naturally your curiosity will develop, and you'll want to maybe read up on some of the resources I'll share here. I'll tell you, the first time I teach a text, I read it really closely and write down my thoughts and comments. But the second time I do read it, I read a bunch of criticism, not because I'm going to share, scholars' opinions with 15-year-olds. But what critics often do is they remind you of the complexity of something, and they remind you of all the questions you could ask. And to me, that's where it gets really interesting. So anyway, I would focus on the primary text, but now that you've read the text, supposedly, by all means, poke around and watch some of these podcasts and videos and maybe grab a book or two and flip through, and particularly the next time you engage with the Odyssey. So the first one, and this is sort of at a 10,000-foot view, is really just a book about war itself. And it's by war correspondent Chris Hedges. And a colleague of mine teaches this book in a class he calls War and Peace. And it's called War as a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And it's one of the most breathtaking nonfiction works I've ever read. And while he only dedicates a little bit of time to Homer, the information and the stories and the anecdotes and the thesis of the book very much pertains to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And here's a key passage from it. War is necrophilia. Again, necrophilia is the perverse love of the dead. So this is a punch in the face first sentence. War is necrophilia. And this necrophilia is central to soldiering, just as it is central to the makeup of suicide bombers and terrorists. The necrophilia is hidden under platitudes about duty or comradeship. It waits, especially in moments when we seem to have little to live for and no hope, or in moments when the intoxication of war is at its pitch to be unleashed. When we spend long enough in war, it comes to us as a kind of release, a fatal and seductive embrace that can consummate the long flirtation in war with our own destruction. The ancient Greeks had a word for such a drive. They called it ekpyresis, which literally means to be consumed by a ball of fire. And they use this word to describe heroes. So definitely check out Chris Hedges. Similarly, another amazing book by Caroline Alexandra is the War That Killed Achilles, the true story of Homer's Iliad and the Trojan War. She actually has a translation of the Iliad that's excellent. A brilliant book. And there's a lot of Odyssey stuff in here too. And here's a passage. This is a comment on a passage from book 9 of the Iliad when Achilles claims to hate the gifts Agamemnon gives him. Remember, Agamemnon the king wants Achilles to fight. Achilles is angry because Agamemnon has stolen his favorite girl / slave. And Agamemnon is trying to bribe him into fighting. And this is a comment by Caroline Alexandra. Life is more precious than glory. This is the unheroic truth disclosed by the greatest warrior at Troy. More extraordinary than its subversion of conventional storyline, the anticipated and triumphant return of the gift-laden hero, is the Iliad's very deliberate confrontation with the core tenets of its own tradition. So it's a book that questions itself, which the Odyssey does as well, I feel. That glory, honor, and fame are more important than life is a heroic convention so old it can be traced securely to Indo-European tradition. Integral to this heroic view is the belief that glory, kleos, is achieved through heroic poetry. In other words, through epics with this unimagined speech. Achilles hijacks the Iliad, taking this particular epic onto thrilling new ground. This book is really, really valuable to me, and he's on YouTube too, giving presentations, but it's Why Homer Matters by Adam Nicholson. He ends up taking like a small boat and kind of travels around the Mediterranean and reads the Odyssey and reads the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's great. And here's a passage from Nicholson, and I think this is really clever. And these are all readable, by the way, too. They're not super academic monographs or articles, but these are readable like for regular people like me and maybe like you. Nothing irks Odysseus more powerfully than the suggestion that he's merely a sea robber or a tradesman. Is he not a hero? Has he not fought at Troy? Has he not suffered at sea? But the suspicion won't go away. When he and his crew find themselves facing Polyphemus, the Cyclops, the same idea reoccurs. Strangers, who are you? The Cyclops asks them. Where do you come from? Sailing over the sea waves. Are you trading? Or are you roaming wherever luck takes you over the sea like pirates? The Iliad and the Odyssey are not sermons. We do not want Achilles or even Odysseus to be our model for a man. 4, and if I were to tell teachers or new readers of the Odyssey to buy one book, it's this one. This is a chapter by chapter, 3 or 4 page commentary on each section of the Odyssey, very basic, text-based, really, really helpful. And one could use this in a research paper as well, the story of the Odyssey. And here's a passage that I really like. It's about one of the saddest things in the Odyssey, particularly if you're a dog person, the death of Argos. There could not be a better symbol of the abuse of Odysseus's house and most valued personal possessions than the decrepit, neglected state of this once magnificent beast. He's visible proof of what the suitors are doing to Odysseus's possessions. Most of all, the Argos episode adds a note of danger, for it shows that Odysseus's disguise can be penetrated. Remember, Argos just on instinct recognizes Odysseus, right? In fact, has been before he even crosses the threshold. So really, really good stuff. And then I've mentioned these books before. Really read them just as a citizen, not just as a reader. Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming by psychologist Jonathan Shea. This is brilliant. He says in the Odyssey book, I believe that everyone who makes the transition from battle to home, especially if the transition's made quickly, fears for his sanity at some point. This may only be when he awakens from a nightmare or when he notices that he senses danger around every corner. 6, and I read this one somewhat recently. Daniel Mendelsohn is a classicist who works at Bard College, and his 81-year-old father, Jay Mendelsohn, who was a scientist, decided to audit his Odyssey seminar. So he had to teach the Odyssey to a bunch of 19-year-olds and his 81-year-old dad. It's funny. It's a personal narrative. They then later go on a cruise in the Mediterranean that tracing Odysseus' journey together. And it largely parallels the Telemachus and Odysseus relationship in the book. He offers various parallels in his own life. Really readable, really lighthearted, really thoughtful. So in Book 11 of the Odyssey, Achilles in Hades tells Odysseus that the heroic code he believes in isn't worth it. He actually says he'd rather be, the sidekick or the assistant of a slave on earth than the leader of all the dead. So here's the professor's dad, who's 81, Jay Mendelsohn, comments out loud in class, and he says something that only an older person could say. Daniel's dad says, "This passage reveals you could spend your whole life believing in something. Then you get to a point and you realize you were wrong about the whole thing." There's some great reading of the Odyssey in this book, but there's also just some really, this book to me is a good reminder that this really difficult poem isn't simply a museum piece to write thesis papers about, that they're very much real flesh and blood people with flesh and blood relatable problems and challenges. 7, and for those who are teachers listening to this, check out the Approaches to Teaching series. I have approaches to teaching Toni Morrison's novels, approaches to teaching Bleak House, approaches teaching Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare's comedies, Frankenstein, Pride and Prejudice. It's a text with a variety of teachers, everything from high school and community college, military academies, universities, grad schools, and all their different approaches to teaching the text. It's a great series. If there's a book work of literature that you want to read or maybe teach somewhat differently, this is the series to go to. And they have probably about 100 of them. So this is from an essay by George D. Economou called Teaching Homer in Honors Composition. So he teaches the Iliad and the Odyssey in a class that has all this personal narrative writing. He says, "I'm convinced that Homer suffers no indignities by serving as the reading for a composition class. In fact, the students and teacher came away the richer and his circulation a little wider." There's an essay, Homer taught as art. Homer taught through the prism of history, on and on, just different approaches. Check out the series. It's great. And then here's a podcast. It's pretty rudimentary. It's about 25 minutes. The first half is a lot of summary, frankly, but it's called the Inner Time podcast out of the BBC. There's a Hamlet one. They're all, kind of all the great classics in the humanities. They have little commentaries on, and they have scholars just talk. So there's a scholar named Edith Hall who is a professor at Durham University, and she's commenting, and I've mentioned this similarly before, it's just amazing. When Odysseus hears the story of the Trojan horse, his cries are compared to the cries of a war widow doomed to rape, torture, and slavery. So here's what Edith Hall says, and I never thought of this. This is just in the podcast. She says, "It's as though that extraordinary simile shows that Odysseus knows what people like him do to other people. He actually is aware on some deep level how dangerous his cunning is to humanity, and that's what's so special about the Odyssey." I never connected those dots until the other day, and I just think that's great, that thinking about the Trojan War reminds him of some of the raping and pillaging he's done, and he's heard that woman's cry before. He knows what that's like. I just think that's great. This is a good conversation. Like I said, it's only about 25 minutes. My favorite online conversation about the Odyssey is this one. It's pretty long. It's a couple hours. And it features Christopher Hitchens, who's just wonderful, brilliant, funny, sarcastic. Deborah Dickerson, who's a veteran, American military veteran and author. Jody Bottom, who's a conservative columnist and editor, who very much looks at the text as a sort of ethics manual, which I think is a problem, which Hitchens points out. And then Stanley Labarda, who's a professor of classics and a translator of the Odyssey. And there's a great moment about 10 minutes, 20 minutes in, where Jody Bottom makes the point that the Odyssey teaches you universal virtues, the nobility of universal virtues. And that's pretty complicated considering the raping and the pillaging and the adultery and the murders and that happen in the book. But anyway, Christopher Hitchens says to Jody Bottom, who's asserting that the Odyssey teaches the virtues, Hitchens says, the idea of the soldier's life in Homer is represented without any euphemism at all. In other words, Homer doesn't sugarcoat what it's like being a soldier. There's the absolute pitilessness of it. There's no attempt in Homer to present the Trojan War as a noble war. It's not fought in self-defense. It's a war of aggression, of conceit. There's no attempt to teach us there are some things worth fighting for. Their enemies are protean, they're shapeshifters, right? They change all the time. Some are evil and some are just in the way. Christopher Hitchens really looks closely at the poem, and that if it's trying to teach you some sort of ethical behavior, man, it's really hard to take that away if you really are reading the words on the page. There's some great arguments. There's some really good arguments. And really what this conversation entails are in my view, two major perspectives. There are some people that come to books and they just have certain ideas they want to find in books, and they look for them. And if they don't find them, they pretend they're there. They fit square pegs in round holes. And Hitchens, I think, is reading the Odyssey a little more honestly. And last but not least, Emily Wilson, our translator, who's just unbelievable. She's a classicist at Penn. She gave a 2019 lecture at the British Library, which is really worth your time. In fact, just YouTube her, and she gives various lectures on it and is on various podcasts. Some deal with problems of translation, some deal with the text itself. And I love this, and I love this as our closing moment together here. The Odyssey is about questions I think about all the time. Is the me from 40 years ago the same that's the me now? It's also about whether we can be the same person in new places with different relationships, how to deal with those who aren't like us, how to form communities, and whether communities are formed by keeping people in or keeping people out. The Odyssey is about grief, rage, recognition, different definitions of home, and about hiding. It's a poem which turns the details of everyday life into these magical resonant symbols that define both divine and human relationships. I love how the world of Homer is both very ordinary, but also at any moment someone could turn out to be a goddess. So good luck. Please keep me posted on how your reading's going. I don't at all claim to have all the answers. I just really love this poem, and I love talking about it with other folks. And I hope your reading is enjoyable and rich, and it leads you to other great books. Keep in touch, and happy reading.